Now, we will discuss the first continent, which is Australia. Australia is the world's smallest continent and one of the world's biggest countries located in the southern hemisphere between the Pacific and Indian Seas. The name of Australia is derived from the Latin Terra Australis, which means southern land, a name for a mythical continent in the southern hemisphere that has been used since ancient times. The term Terra Australis was naturally given to the new eras when Europeans first began exploring and surveying Australia in the 17th century. Australia's capital is Canberra, located in the southeast between the larger and more important economic and cultural centres of Sydney and Melbourne. With deserts in the centres, tropical rainforests in the northeast, and mountain ranges in the southeast, it is a mega diverse country with a broad diversity of landscapes and temperatures. Next, we move on to the climate. The climate of Australia is significantly influenced by ocean currents, including the Indian Ocean Dipole and the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which is correlated with the periodic flood and the seasonal tropical low-pressure system that produces cyclones in the northern Australia. Because of these reasons, rainfalls varies dramatically from year to year. The northern half of the nation enjoys a tropical climate with summer rains, or also called as monsoon. Temperatures in northern Australia are exceptionally high during summer, which is from December to February, when the sun is directly above. The water has minimal influence, and the uplands were not large enough or high enough to have more than other local effects. A Mediterranean climate dominates in the southwest part of the nation. Tasmania and coastal Victoria have oceanic climates, whereas the upper half of New South Wales has humid subtropical climates, with alpine and subpolar oceanic climates in the highlands. Arid to semi-arid climate dominates the interior. Next, we move on to the environmental problems in Australia. The first environmental problems in Australia is climate change. In the last 2 decades, climate change has become a prominent political talking issue in Australia. During the first decade of the 21st century, persistent flood and the consequent water restrictions are examples of natural phenomena having a concrete impact on economic and political reality. Australia is the top 10 countries in the world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per capita. Climate change is having a severe impact on the ecology, economy, and communities of Australia because of its wide, dry, and semi-arid areas, already warm temperature, high yearly rainfall variability, and with an existing water supply challenges. Australia is vulnerable to the consequences of global warming expected over the next 50 to 100 years. Next, environmental problems is conservation. Conservation is a state and federal policy concern in Australia. Australia is one of the world's most ecologically varied countries, having a huge number of endemic species. It is critical to protect this biodiversity for future generations. The preservation of biodiversity, particularly by safeguarding the surviving rainforest, is a critical conservation problem. Human-caused habitat damage, such as land clearance, continues to be the leading source of biodiversity loss in Australia. The Australian rainforests are extremely important to the conservation movement. Australia is the only Western country with substantial tracts of unbroken rainforests. Forests supply timber, pharmaceuticals, and foods, and they should be managed to get the most out of them. More than 100 species of wildlife are now threatened with extinction. There are many domestic animals have recently been focus of many conservation organizations, such as the endangered Tasmanian devil, northern tiger quail, and many more. The protection of the Great Barrier Reef, whaling, shark culling, oil spill, and ocean dumping are all major challenges with marine conservation in Australia. The third environmental problems in Australia is land degradation. According to Jared Diamond, Australia's #1 environmental challenge is land degradation. Part of Australia are still clear-cutting old-growth forests. This frequently involves the destruction of natural ecosystems in favor of monoculture plants. Australia was ranked 46 out of 172 nations in the 2018 Forest Landscapes Integrity Index with a mean score of 7.22 out of 10. Indigenous Australians practiced fire stick farming in the prehistory of Australia, which was an early kind of land clearing that resulted in long-term ecological changes. With European colonization, land clearings for agriculture, notably livestock, cotton, and wheat production, became most widespread. A total of 30% of native plant cover has been lost since European arrival. The next environmental problem is waterway health. Waterway conservation is an important priority in Australia for a variety of reasons, including habitat and biodiversity, as well as human usage of the rivers. Irrigation in Australia is threatening the Murray-Darling Basin, generating excessive salt level that harms agriculture and biodiversity in New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. Pesticide runoff and drought have also an impact on these waterways. And the last environmental problems in Australia is water use. In Australia, water consumption is a serious sustainability concern. Water is becoming a major issue for not only Australia but the entire world. As drought become more common, people have limited access to water, and there are even places where there are no water at all, such as India. We must conserve our water for the future and increase access to it, as we currently only have about 5%. We move on to the history in Australia. The native people in Australia are called Aborigines. These individuals were the ancestors of today's Indigenous Australian. Aboriginal Australian culture is one of the world's oldest continuously existing cultures. During the 17th century, the Dutch charted the western and northern coastline and named the island continent New Holland. A number of shipwrecks left men stranded, or in the case of Batavia, stranded for mutiny and murder. Captain James Cook travelled down the east coast in 1770, naming it New South Australia and claiming it for Great Britain. After a decade of preparation, constitutional conventions and referendums, the colonies were federated on January 1, 1901, leading in the foundation of the Commonwealth of Australia as a country and the entry into effect of the Australian Constitution. Following the 1907 Imperial Conference, Australia was given the status of self-governing dominion inside the British Empire. The Westminster Statute of 1931 formally dissolved most of Australia's constitutional ties with the United Kingdom. From 1939 to 1945, Australia fought alongside the Allies in World War II. Australia had major advances in living standards, leisure time, and suburban expansion in the decades following World War II. The nation supported a big surge of immigration from throughout Europe under the motto "Populate or Die," referring to such immigrants as New Australians. For culture in Australia, English is the main language of Australia because of its history. History of immigration made Australia is a home to a diverse range of cultures. Since 1788, Australian culture has predominantly been Western, with early Anglo-Celtic settlers having a considerable effect. Other influences include Australian Aboriginal culture, customs introduced to the nation by waves of immigration from all over the world, and American culture. Since European arrival, there has been a cultural divergence and evolutions that has resulted in a distinct Australian culture. The original inhabitants of Australia used the oral tradition, including song and dance with gestural storytelling to entertain, instruct, guide, and reveal spiritual truth, as well as physical geography and the location of life-sustaining resources. This tradition disrupted and more or less destroyed by the arrival of the British and was replaced by a literature that imitated European models. Sausage sizzles, lamingtons, meat pies, and Vegemite are iconic Australian foods. Australia is a leading exporter and consumer of wine. The first settlers introduced British and Irish cuisine to the continent. It is known for its cafe and coffee culture in the urban centres. Cricket and football are the predominant sports in Australia during the summer and winter months, respectively. Australia is also notable for the water-based sports such as swimming and surfing. Australia's major religion is Christianity. Other religions are likewise expanding their groups such as Islam, Buddhism, and many more. We're now discussing the current issues in Australia. The first current issues in Australia is asylum seekers and refugees. Approximately 230 refugees and asylum seekers remain in Papua New Guinea and Nauru at time of writing, with more than 900 refugees admitted to the United States under an Australia-US resettlement deal. Australia announced it will end its offshore agreement with Papua New Guinea at the end of 2021, transferring people who remain there to Nauru. More than 80 refugees and asylum seekers transferred to Australia from Papua New Guinea and Nauru for medical or other reasons remain in detention. Australia has rejected offers by New Zealand to take some of their refugees. At least 12 refugees and asylum seekers have died in Australia's offshore processing system since 2013, 6 of them suicides. Some of the refugees and asylum seekers transferred from Papua New Guinea and Nauru to Australia have been detained in hotel rooms where access to sunlight, space to exercise and fresh air is limited. The next current issue in Australia is Indigenous rights. Indigenous Australians are significantly overrepresented in the criminal justice system, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people comprising 30% of Australia's adult prison population, but just 3% of the national population. At least 11 Indigenous people died in custody in Australia in 2021. A coronial inquest into the death of a 36-year-old Aboriginal man in the New South Wales prison after he had an asthma attack found there was a confused, unreasonably delayed, and uncoordinated medical response by prison staff. We now move to economic activities in Australia. Australia have 3 main economic activities. First is a mining industry. Mining industry is a major sector in Australia. It is also a huge contributor to Australia's economy and encourages immigration to this country. The second economic activity is agriculture industry. Australia also become a major producer and exporter for agriculture products. Basically, only 2% of Australia's agriculture land is cultivated. However, the remains are devoted to livestock grazing. The last economic activity is service industry. There are various types of services offered by the service industry in Australia, such as finance, tourism, creativity and culture, media, education and logistics.
Hi, my name is Muhammad Zain bin Muhammad Yusof. I will be present about Oceania. Oceania, collective name for the islands scattered throughout most of the Pacific Ocean. The most popular usage delimit Oceania further by eliminating Indonesia, Taiwan and the Philippines, because the peoples and cultures of those islands are more closely related historically to the Asian mainland. Oceania have more than 10,000 islands and with a total land area of approximately 317,700 square miles. Subregion. Oceania is usually said to consist of 3 large geographic areas, which is Polynesia, Micronesia and Melanesia. Polynesia. The name Polynesia means many islands. It applies mainly to islands with similar cultures that lie in the Central Pacific. Among the countries of Polynesia are New Zealand, Tuvalu, Tonga and Samoa. Also included are France Overseas Territory, Wallis and Futuna, and overseas country French Polynesia, which incorporates the Tuamotu, Gambier, Society, Austral, Leeward, and Marquesas Islands. Micronesia. The name Micronesia means small islands. Among the region's sovereign countries are Palau, Nauru, the Federated State of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. Kiribati lies largely within Micronesia, but its eastern Phoenix and Line Islands jut into Polynesia. Also in Micronesia are the United States territories of Wake Island and Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands are Commonwealth in association with the United States. Melanesia. Melanesia means islands inhabited by blacks, a term introduced by racial-minded Europeans. Not all Melanesians have dark skin. Among the independent nations of Melanesia are Fiji, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. Melanesia also includes Papua New Guinea, which occupies the eastern part of the enormous island of New Guinea, as well as Bismarck Archipelago and other nearby islands. This is the map of Oceania. Next is history. The first settlers of Australia, New Guinea, and the large islands just to the east arrived more than 60,000 years ago. Oceania was first explored by Europeans from 16th century onwards. Portuguese explorers between 1512 and 1526 reached the Tanimbar Island, some of the Caroline Islands, and the West Papua New Guinea. Climate. Oceania is generally hot and humid year-round. Low islands are at the mercy of the winds, which can bring enough rain to create large forests on some islands while leaving others dry wastelands. In general, in the tropical areas, strong trade winds blow from the east. Culture. Polynesia. Polynesia is the next most populous region. At the other extreme, Pitcairn Island has only 50 people, descendants of the mountaineers of the British ship HMS Bounty and their Polynesian companions. The Maori of New Zealand make up the largest number of indigenous Polynesians in the region. Nearly 3/4 of the country's people are of European descent. Next is Micronesia. Micronesia has the smallest population in Oceania. As in Polynesia, most of its population is widely dispersed in small groups on many islands. The largest cluster is on Guam, many of whose people are recent arrivals from Asia and the United States. Asians are also quite numerous in the Northern Marianas and Palau. Melanesia. Of the three regions within Oceania, Melanesia has the largest population, especially in Papua New Guinea and Fiji. In addition to large number of indigenous islanders, there are many Indians, Chinese, and Indonesians. The latter groups have been called non-native, though many of them were born on the islands. Nevertheless, they are often subject to racial and ethnic biases and even outright bigotry. Economy in Oceania. Major source of individual and family income in Oceania includes agriculture, fishing, mining, and tourism. Also important is the money sent home by workers who have found jobs in foreign countries, often as plantation or mines laborers. Agriculture and fishing. Traditional households support themselves mainly by agriculture and fishing. Many households maintain gardens where crops are grown in shifting cultivation, also called slash and burn agriculture. The more traditional societies of coastal Oceania still venture onto the reefs and open sea, catching and gathering fish, crustaceans, sea slug, and a host of other edible marine species. Next is mining. Mining is important. Oceania's mineral reserves are small by world standards. For decades, the main source of phosphate was Nauru, but its center has been transformed into a wasteland. New Caledonia is among the world's leading producers of nickels, so its economy is influential in the region. New Zealand also mines coal, natural gas and petroleum, as well as minerals used in the construction and industry. Tourism. Because opportunities and natural resources are limited on most islands, many see tourism as a major potential source of income. However, many jobs in tourism are manual and seasonal, and high travel times and costs can limit the number of visitors. Nevertheless, in recent decades, tourism investment has significantly increased in Hawaii, New Zealand, Guam, Fiji, Tahiti, and other islands. Issues in Oceania. The State of the Environment report published by Caritas Aotearoa, New Zealand, on behalf of the region, tracks 5 key environmental issues affecting the lives of Oceania's people: coastal erosion, coastal flooding, and sea level rise. King tides continue to affect small islands around Papua New Guinea, but the experience of Naui village in Fiji shows coastal impacts on large islands too. Coastal sand mining in Solo Solo, Samoa has destroyed a beach. The low-lying Papua community in Tonga face frequent flooding during the king tides and storm. The small coastal community of Mitimiti in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is planting sand dunes and taking a flexible approach to possible future relocation of buildings. Next is extreme weather. A series of cyclones and other severe storm events brought flooding and destruction to Oceania, particularly Tonga, Fiji, and parts of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Preparation and coordination proved key in minimizing greater loss of life in Tonga, as did resilient housing, both recent and from 24 years ago. Learning from past disasters is being applied at Tutu Rural Training Center in Fiji after Cyclone Winston, and in the highlands of Papua New Guinea after the El Nino. Third is food and water. Sea level rise is impacting seafood sources on the Carteret Islands and mainland Australia, while coastal sand mining in Samoa impacts local fish supplies. Logging and land grabs are impacting food and water sources in Papua New Guinea, but legal challenges have made some advances. In West Papua in Indonesia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, chemicals and climate combine to choke off a local eel supply. In Fiji, the Tutu Agriculture Training Center is using an integrated approach to water and farming practices. Offshore mining and drilling. The Nautilus deep sea mining project in Papua New Guinea is subject to further delay while community opposition grows. Species such as whales, tuna, and sharks could be affected by noise, vibration, and light pollution caused by mining equipment and surface vessels, as well as potential leaks and spill of fuel and toxic products. Caritas welcomes the New Zealand government stopping further offshore oil explorations license being issued. A new seabed mining community resource is launched for the Pacific, while Caritas joins an international appeal to the International Seabed Authority to stop issuing contracts for exploration until the real need for deep sea mining is addressed. Last is climate finance. Caritas took concern about the poor missing out on climate-related funds to the global stage. Through United Nations Climate Change Negotiation and the Talanoa Dialogue, initiated by Fiji, both Australia and New Zealand need to do more to cut emissions, adapt to climate change, and support climate finance. Several Caritas partners are forging on with locally developed project for carbon storage, renewable energy, and forced relocation. Women, girls, and people with disabilities are still being sidelined in climate change decisions. In practical terms related to mobilizing finance to address resilience, those most harmed are still being left behind. That's all for me. Thank you.
Next, I'm going to present about Antarctica. Antarctica is the southernmost continent and site of the South Pole, is a virtually uninhabited, ice-covered landmass with total area 14.2 million square kilometers. Most cruises to the continent visit the Antarctic Peninsula, which stretches towards South America. It's known for the Lemaire Channel and Paradise Harbour, striking iceberg flying passageways, and Port Lockroy, a former British research station turned museum. The peninsula's isolated terrain also shelters rich wildlife, including many penguins. It has no permanent population, but typically hosts 1,000 until 5,000 visiting scientists. Antarctica contains all four of Earth's south poles, which are the geographic South Pole, the geomagnetic South Pole, the magnetic South Pole, and the South Pole of rotation. A little known fact about Antarctica is that it is the largest desert on Earth. How many countries are in Antarctica? Technically, 0. There are no countries in Antarctica. However, 7 different countries have claimed territory in Antarctica. 7 nations that have territorial claims in Antarctica are France, United Kingdom, New Zealand, Norway, Australia, Chile, and Argentina. The United States, Peru, Russia, and South Africa have all reserved their right to claim territory in the future, and Brazil currently has a zone of interest but not an actual claim. Approximately 40 to 50 million years ago, temperatures across Antarctica reached up to 17 degrees Celsius. Thus, at one time, the continent was habitable. In fact, scientists have discovered fossils indicating that Antarctica was once covered by forests and inhabited by dinosaurs. Hence, if humans had existed 40 to 50 million years ago, they could conceivably have lived on the continent. From the time of ancient Greece, humans had speculated that there was a continent in the far south of the world, but confirmation of Antarctica's existence did not happen until 1820, when members of a Russian expedition first sighted it. In the early 20th century, a race began to determine who would be the first to reach the South Pole. Next is climate. Antarctica is the coldest continent on Earth. The average temperature in the interior throughout the year is about negative 57 Celsius, with the minimum temperature being negative 90 Celsius during the winter season. Although the coast is warmer and temperatures can reach a maximum of between negative 2 Celsius and 8 Celsius during the summer, it is, on average, the coldest, windiest, and driest of all the continents on Earth. Technically, Antarctica is a desert because it is so dry there, with an average annual precipitation of just 166 mm along the coastal regions and even less when moving further inland. With such cold conditions, the snow hardly ever melts. Instead, it will mostly become compressed over time to form part of the ice sheet. This is known as an ice cap climate. This ice sheet is, on average, 1.6 km thick and covers about 98% of the entire continent. Antarctic climate is so cold, and strangely enough, one can suffer serious sunburn while stare as the snow acts as a reflector which reflects nearly all the ultraviolet rays. So although you may not feel the heat, you still need to make sure to keep your skin safe from the rays. Next is natural resources in Antarctica. Firstly is ice. One of the Antarctica's most important resources is ice. It is said that Antarctica's ice accounts for 90% of the world's fresh water. As a resource, it has potential as a freshwater supply. Some people have considered towing icebergs from Antarctica to parts of the world in need of fresh water. At present, the delivery costs make these ventures unprofitable. Another possible use of the ice on Antarctica is as a long-term deep freeze storage storage site for grain and other foods. Again, the cost of shipping and handling are prohibitive. Next is petroleum. Petroleum deposits are formed when plants and small animal remains are buried in a marine environment by sand and mud. These remains then build up as hydrocarbons and are trapped by a layer of rock that the hydrocarbons cannot pass through. These capped rocks then store the petroleum underground until it is pumped out by wells. At this time, there has been no petroleum exploration attempt and there are no known petroleum resources in Antarctica. Next is coal. There are coal deposits found along the coast of Antarctica. It is also very widespread throughout the Transantarctic Mountains. These deposits were formed between 35 million and 55 million years ago when Antarctica was covered by ancient swamps. Coal forms in swamps as plants die and are buried before they can be completely decomposed. Coal is used as a source of direct heat and also to generate electricity in coal burning power plants. The main problem of developing coal in Antarctica is that the cost of mining and delivering the coal is so much higher than the cost of coal in the rest of the world market. It may be possible for coal to be used in some small research station for a source of heat. And lastly is metallic minerals. Mineral resources have not been found in great quantities so far due to the small amount of rock that is exposed. It is believed that since the other continents that were once attached to Antarctica to form Gondwana have metallic and non-metallic minerals, that Antarctica probably has similar minerals. It is also known that rock layers such as those in Antarctica commonly contain large amounts of cobalt, chromium, nickel, vanadium, copper, iron, and platinum group minerals. Although coal, chromium, nickel, gold, and other minerals have been found, they have not been in large enough quantities to exploit. The 1991 Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty also restricts a struggle for resources. In 1998, a compromise agreement was reached to place an indefinite ban on mining to be reviewed in 2048, further limiting economic development and exploitation. Next is climate issues. Firstly is climate change. Climate change is the greatest long-term threat to the region. Some parts of Antarctica are experiencing significant ice retreat, including the collapse of ice shelf along the Antarctic Peninsula, while other areas are increasing. If our climate continues to warm and acidify the Southern Ocean, scientists predict that krill population could be devastated, undermining the entire food chain. Next is increased fishing pressure and illegal fishing. As global fisheries become depleted, there is growing interest to expand fishing throughout the region. Krill fishing needs to be closely monitored and controlled to ensure whales, penguins, and other wildlife are protected. Illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing also threatens fish stock in some areas of the Southern Ocean and thereby the seabirds and marine mammals that depends upon them. The harmful fishing method used by IUU fishing vessels also caused the direct deaths of countless seabirds. Next is marine pollution. Persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, have been measured around Antarctica and detected in wildlife. Microplastics are emerging as a threat in the region. Increasing quantities of plastic are washing up on the Antarctic coastline and sub-Antarctic island. Next is invasive species. Many Antarctic species have evolved in isolation from the rest of the world. Consequently, they have developed no means of defending themselves from the invasive species carried aboard ships. WWF catalyzed and helped fund the removal of rabbits from Macquarie Island and is now helping to remove mice from the Antipodes Island. And lastly, ice and penguins. Ice shelves are the floating extensions of a grounded ice sheet. One of the largest ice shelves, the Rhone-Fletcher, covers an area slightly smaller than Spain. Each summer, a significant amount of meltwater is produced, which can only be tolerated so long before the ice shelf will weaken and retreat. Climate in the Antarctic Peninsula has warmed by 3 Celsius, meaning that once stable ice shelves are now retreating. Collapsing ice shelf could lead to several feet of sea level rise by 2100, and between 1980 and 2020, several penguins colonies on the Antarctic Peninsula vanished. Next is history of economic activities. Firstly is whaling. The history of whaling in Antarctic waters is a tale of greed and excess, an activity that has been described as being more like mining than a sustainable fishery. Whaling began in the Antarctic waters in the 18,000s, with humpback whales being the primary target of most commercial fishing vessels. Within 10 years, the humpback species become extremely rare in these waters, and the development of new technologies allow fishermen to go after the much faster swimming blue whales. Today, commercial whaling has all but ceased around the world, although some nations, particularly Japan, continue to catch whales in the name of scientific research. To find out if the time has come to recommend commercial whaling in the Antarctic region, whales are now protected by the International Conventions for the Regulation of Whaling. Next is sealing. In the 17,000 and 18,000, long before the continent of Antarctica was discovered, southern fur seals were almost completely wiped out by commercial ventures from Europe and North America. Fur seals' pelts were extremely popular, largely for their dense, short, fiber fur, and were often made into ladies' winter coats. Like whaling, sealing become big businesses in the waters around Antarctica, and many people fear their dwindling numbers would lead to a disastrous collapse of the region's biosystem. Today, thanks to the Antarctic Treaty, none such economic activities are permitted in Antarctica. The treaty also states that on Antarctica itself, no Antarctic bird or land animal can be killed or captured without a permit granted only for scientific reasons under the terms of the treaty. Next is the economic activities in Antarctica today. Firstly is fishing. The largest economic activity of value in Antarctica is the capture and offshore trading of fish. Last year alone, fisheries on the continent reportedly landed nearly 150,000 tons of fish. The fisheries of Antarctica target three main species, which are Pentagonian and Antarctica toothfish, mackerel icefish, and krill. The Conventions on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources (CCAMLR) determines the recommended catch limits and licensing requirements for all marine species in Antarctica. Next is tourism. Tourism had existed in Antarctica since about 1957. Most of this has been small-scale expedition tourism and is currently subject to the provisions of the Antarctic Treaty and Environmental Protocol, but is basically self-regulated by the International Associations of Antarctic Tour Operators (IAATO). No commercials or private aircraft is permitted to land on the continent of Antarctica. Antarctic sightseeing flights, which flew over the country but never land, operated in places such as Chile, Australia, and New Zealand for many years, but these were suspended after the Airbus tragedy. Today, the only company that offers this type of overflights to Antarctica is Qantas Airlines of Australia, which resumed the flight in the early of 1990s. And lastly is research centers. As of 2012, approximately 30 countries maintain roughly 70 research stations in Antarctica, 40 of which operate year-round and 30 that are open only during the austral summer. Staffing these centers are approximately 4,000 researchers, only 1,000 of whom remain on the continent during the winter. The largest of these stations is the McMurdo Station, once the site of a portable 1.8 MW nuclear power station erected about halfway off Observation Hill by the United States Navy in 1962. The reactor from this station was eventually shut down 10 years later and shipped back to the US, along with more than 100 drums of radioactive earth. Following its removal, it took 6 years before the site was deemed decontaminated enough for unrestricted use. Lastly is the culture of Antarctica. Firstly is polar plunge. Jumping in the sea wearing swimming attire is a surprisingly popular thing to do. Originally, something that was done by members of scientific bases, particularly at midwinter or Christmas, this has spread across the continent and now happens far more often as shorter-term visitors in the summer want to have a go-to. The usual procedure is to jump into the sea tied to a rope. In the winter, this may require a hole to be cut through the sea ice to access the sea first. There may be a ladder to help you get out At the other side, in open water, the plunk may include a short swim to a nearby boat. Next is Sydney Thin Ice Ridge. At the start of the winter, as the temperature fell and the sea began to freeze in the cove in front of the base commander will inspect the ice and declare it ready for the Thin Ice Ridge. This will happen the same day as the state of the ice was critical. It should be almost thick enough to sustain being walked on, but not reliably so. If it was left overnight, it would probably be too thick. Everyone would then go and get kit up in their wetsuit and possibly associated fancy dress and assembly at the start point. On the word go, everyone would rush off across the ice and start to fall through it into the sea. The course was 300 until 400 meter long. It favored light runners with big feet, but slower runners could jump on the ice next to the ladders, sending both into the icy sea. So it took a long time to finish the course.